Good afternoon. We're here at the Tesla Tech 2025 Extraordinary Technology Conference in Albuquerque at the Crown Plaza Hotel. We're here to explore and discuss Tesla technology, of course, magnetic motors, zero-point energy, energy savers, cosmic radiant energy, Brown's gas, plasma technology, electrogravitation, electromedicine, and all things Tesla technology. We're excited to be sharing the table here with some extraordinary minds. We'll be introducing ourselves. Some have been in this field for many decades, creating incredible technology, some of which you're going to find out about. So I look forward to discussing it. My name is Carol Rominger, and I'll turn it over to you.
I am Bob Herlick, now retired after 52 years on the university's faculties as distinguished professor. I met Malcolm Bendall 2 years ago and recognized that somehow or other we fit together and began working with him since that time.
Hello, my name is Sheila Rahman, and I am a frequency scientist. I was a touring musician around the world for over 7 years in Germany, and then I moved to Sedona and started getting deep with frequency research and seeing how frequencies influence the electromagnetic, plasma, and multidimensional spectrum that we live in. So that's what I do.
Oh, I'm Maury King. I got sucked in really early as a graduate student. When I discovered that there's something called the zero-point energy, it really exists, and I posed the question: can this be tapped as an energy source? And since I was getting working on my PhD, I said I have to use only the standard literature. And the more that I drilled into what was in the actual journals and the experiments, the more convinced I was that there's really something there. So I've been speaking at these conferences since it started in 1984. I was speaking at other conferences in the 70s and pretty well stuck to the theme. The evidence is all there. I believe inventors have stumbled across it, and we're in for a big surprise for humanity.
Aloha, my name is Robin Lee Hill. I'm the founder of the Global Freedom Alliance. I sit on the World Council for Health and also the board of directors for Hawaii Unites. We are fighting the most important biological sovereignty case on the planet at present. And the Global Freedom Alliance is involved in freeing the children, freeing the knowledge, freeing technology. When you do these things, you free humanity. The time is now. The time is not to feed fear anymore. The time is not to keep things hidden anymore. The time is to free everything so that children wake up to hope with teeth, tangible, free, and able to look into a future where peace and sovereignty is the standard. Mahalo.
Beautiful. So let's talk a little bit about the beginning of the zero-point energy journey that started this process and how that brings us together here today with the technology that's being worked on to create some really incredible outcomes that will improve humanity.
So my experience was I'm in electrical engineering and systems engineering. I think it was a master's PhD program in that, and I had the misfortune of picking up a book, a UFO book, and I remember it's called Beyond Earth. And I picked it up for science fiction, right, just for fun. And what happened was I believed the witnesses, police, pilots, people that were being smeared, had everything to lose by reporting it. But I didn't know that much about gravity. So I asked the question, is anti-gravity possible? It looked like some type of inertial propulsion. Later I'll learn it was actually gravity. And then but I didn't know enough about it. So went over to the physics department, made friends with a gravitational expert in physics, and learned from the big book by Meissner, Thorne, and Wheeler called Gravitation. The last 2 chapters of the book talked about the zero-point energy. And I go, what is this? They never taught us any of this in the engineering school when the extraordinary energy densities embedded in the fabric of space. And so the rules for making gravity was you had to have the equivalent of a huge mass to make you fall in a different direction. And darn if the energy densities were being quoted in right there in John Wheeler's work, numbers like 10 to the 93rd grams per cubic centimeter. It was just derived from basically equations of general relativity and equations of quantum electrodynamics. And we called it the already unified field theory. And he had his original publication, I think in 1957 in the Physical Review. And I go, oh, how come you didn't tell the engineers this exists? We just might do something with this, right? So I started doing the research. What would influence the energy? In order to make a propulsion, you would basically warp space-time. And if we had to provide all that energy, we're not even close to what's required. But there it was in the zero-point energy. And so I dove into quantum electrodynamics right at the very end. I've done all my coursework and now I'm just starting again to learn what are the elementary particles that actually influence it the most. And it was right there in the textbook. I said, it was the heavy particles like the nuclei and what they call vacuum polarization is how the particles interact with the vacuum energy. It turns out it's a continuum. They're all part of it. They're not even really separate from it. And that's how you have your waves and quantum waves and et cetera, and all that. It's all intertwined. It turned out that the nature of the vacuum polarization for conduction electrons, that's your normal wires, right? Essentially in thermodynamic equilibrium with it. But the nuclei, steep lines of convergence, and the vacuum polarization was very different. So this is thus working with those particles would influence the vacuum energy, working with the heavy particles, the heavy ions, the nuclei of the atom. And so, and I started looking for experiments. And when they jerk the ions or they oscillate them back and forth, it's called the ion acoustic mode of the plasma. Acoustic means that their frequency happens to be in the kilohertz band where we have sound. And they would have energetic anomalies right in their plasma experiments. And I said, there it is, matching it. But nobody was looking because it took you a lot of energy to make the plasma in the first place. And they did not believe it even existed.
And-
The engineering professors didn't believe it.
Oh, I was just gonna say, what year was that?
This was all started in '74
Okay.
for me. But I picked up that one freaking book and down the rabbit hole I went, right? And it never came out. It was caught in this vortex of more and more cooperation. And this is strictly in academia. So I picked that as a PhD thesis. And I said, my rules of the game were I will use standard references, right, to build my case. And I understand, of course, an experiment would have to be done, but we're guided by the standard references on what to try. And so I produced, I think the first paper that got me started was tapping the zero-point energy. I wrote an earlier paper, is anti-gravity possible? Then I changed it to is artificial gravity possible? Because all you're doing is warping space-time so you fall in the direction you want to be propelled, basically. That's how those craft work. And so I said, in principle, it's actually very easy. Everything was right in front of us. But belief is what blocked it. Nobody heard of it. 99% of scientists are not necessarily physicists, right? And they're never taught that it even exists. Not one engineering professor learned of it. I was the one teaching them. Look, it's right there in the library where the information existed. So I wrote Tapping the Zero-Point Energy, and that was the paper that launched me because it got spread by fax and Xerox. This is back in '78. We did there was a presentation in Philadelphia. And then I got invited out to join a team at Irene Research in Provo, Utah, and there are professors there interested. And so then I found a community of other like minds very much interested in the topic. And once we got rolling with the Tesla conference, the inventors were flocking in. And because they were doing the experiments, they were willing to try. and darn if they didn't do the right stuff. And some of them were quite successful. And then the stories will go into things like suppression and things like that. Well, that's my roots and how I got started, and I never stopped. So I've been speaking on this topic since essentially the 70s.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, I think it's fascinating when we talk about starting there with that whole opening. And then we fast forward to today and the presentation that Robert was doing and some of the things that he shared about, how we came from that place and now what we're able to describe and explore and explain with some of the research that's happened during that time frame up until now. And with that, I'd really like you to share where we are today, kind of contrast that and then fill in between those two timeframes.
Well, the tie-in would begin with the water coherence domains. That water is not a one-phase liquid like we learned about in school. Water molecules floating around, Brownian motion, spaced a little further than they would be from the ice and so on. But actually, there are two phases. One of the phases is the incoherent phase. That's the phase we learned about. It was not until the mid-1980s when an atomic physicist by the name of Giuliani Preparata started to work in condensed matter and began to write the equations and develop the theory that, in fact, there is something in water which came to be known as the coherence domains, whose size is on the order of like around 70 nanometers, containing something like 5 to 6 million water molecules. And these water molecules are doing something very unusual. They're all oscillating in phase with the same frequency, with the same phase. And the properties in the coherence domain is different than the properties in the incoherent water. And the coherence domains explain some things that have not really been well explained with water, which happens to be an amazing, amazing liquid. So what's happening in the coherence domains? How is it that the water molecules begin to oscillate? The answer begins in something that Murray said at the very beginning: 0-point energy. 0-point energy comes from the vacuum. I say vacuum. What is everybody thinking? A volume in which there's nothing. Really? The volume is packed with energy. Particles pop into existence. Particles, antiparticles, they pop into existence. And they're carrying energy. They're carrying frequency. They're oscillating. And they pop out. Now comes the water. They pop in to the vacuum. What's between a water molecule and a water molecule? It's a vacuum. We don't see it because we're at the macro level. But the molecules, between the molecule and a molecule of water, it's a vacuum. That's where the particles pop in from the vacuum there. And they're oscillating. And if we take the simple example of an electron with a hydrogen atom, and think of it, this electron is in the inner orbit of the hydrogen atom, and some particle pops in with exactly the energy that that electron needs to jump from the inner orbit, which is the 1s orbit, to the 2s orbit. And by resonance, by energy resonance, the particle moves, jumps. And this process is a ratchet process. And it continues as that electron jumps from orbit to orbit until it comes to the 5d orbit, which is a particular orbit having an energy around 12 electron volts. And at that point, it begins to oscillate from this outer orbit to the inner orbit, to the outer orbit, to the inner orbit. And all of this time, there's an electromagnetic field inside the domain itself, which comes into existence. And what's happening is resonance. Not only is there coherence, but there's resonance. How is this? Because when the particle jumps from the outer orbit to the inner orbit and loses energy, where does that energy go? It doesn't go back into the vacuum and disappear. It goes to the electromagnetic field. And then when the electron goes from the inner orbit to the outermost orbit, where does it get the energy from? From the electric field. And it's the same thing as a resonance. If I have two strings and a stringed instrument, and the tension is all set, they're the same key, and I pluck one of them, what happens to the other? It begins to oscillate at the same frequency. That's resonance. In the case over here, we have resonance in terms of energy. And we have one more thing happening. When each of the water molecules, we're talking about just a hydrogen atom, when it begins in this molecule, and when it begins in that molecule, two different molecules, two different hydrogen atoms, they don't occur at the same time. So the one on my right is doing something here, and the one on my left is doing something different. It's all incoherent, but they're oscillating at the same frequency. And maybe the easiest image for this is I take pendulums, all of the same design, and I put them on the table, and I start them each from a random place. So now they're oscillating at the same frequency. But when this guy is here, this one is maybe someplace else. And what happens if I leave this on the table? Within some minutes, they're all oscillating at the same way, back and forth. Why? Because the oscillation itself transmits something to the table, and the table brings it to the other pendulums. And the pendulums love the pendulums. And so they all become in unity. And now they're going like this. The electrons are going up and down. So that's a very important thing. It changes the properties between the incoherent water and the coherent water. Everything that happens in the incoherent water is governed by classical physics, electrostatics. The molecules bump into each other and things like that. What happens in the coherence domains? Anything that flows, it's a laminar flow. Nobody bumps into anybody. It's laminar. They're all oscillating exactly in the same up and down, up and down. And this oscillation even extends. H2O, the hydrogen and the oxygen has a valence bond. That electron is oscillating from the oxygen atom to the hydrogen atom to the oxygen atom to the hydrogen. It has another kind of a vibration. So all of these vibrations are all in tune. They're all at the same frequency, all in the same phase. And that gives water different properties than it would have had for the incoherence. One of the main ones is the property of the permittivity of the water, the degree to which the water molecule works around and has charge. Permittivity of water is high, much higher than you would expect from a liquid substance like water, using classical concepts. the permittivity of the water coherence domain is on the order of like 150. It's a constant. The incoherent water is more like 20 or 30 or something like that. And when you measure the water as a bulk, it's 80. High. Where did the water get its energy from? Where did I say? The vacuum. That energy comes in as low energy, high entropy. High entropy is a measure of disorder. If I have an energy source with high entropy and low energy, and now you tell me build a machine that uses this energy, you can't do it. It's not available. But when all the electrons, they're doing this, the electrons in the hydrogen atom, the electrons in the oxygen atom, they're all going up and down, oscillating in energy in the same phase. This is a different story. Things are not happening random. Constant changes, viscosity changes, surface tension changes because of these, permittivity changes. And so we have the amazing liquid of water and all of the amazing properties of water. These are well known. For example, what happens when water is frozen and you get ice? Where does the ice go? You know, if it gets frozen, it gets denser. Yes? Colder the temperature, the denser it is. And what should a denser thing do? Go down. But tell me what would happen to the life forms in the lake or in the ocean if the ice that forms at the top goes down to the bottom. What happens? They can't get any food anymore because the food is on the bottom. The ice floats at the top. Temperature of water gets colder and colder, and it's the densest at around 4 degrees Celsius, and then gets less dense in the ice. And the ice stays on top, floats. And that permits all of the life forms to be able to get their food. That's an amazing thing. And I'll go one step further. Did the water happen by happenstance? Did it just come into existence on its own? There's too many amazing properties that relate to life. The creator is involved. An amazing creator. It's almost unbelievable how everything fits together for the water, the properties of the water. And water itself, throughout the different cultures, the water is honored because it has these special properties. It's absolutely necessary for life.
Beautiful. Yeah, that makes me think about all the wonderful research that's been done and being done for water. We have people like Matsuro Emoto, Veda Austin, Gerald Pollack, who's here, and thinking about this idea that water is life, but the idea that Robert is sharing that so much of the technology that's possible in the 0 point field is related to these incredible principles he's discussing about the water that we don't know, not the water that we're familiar with. And this is what's emerging now. And in that emergence, Sheila has done some amazing work with expressing visually how these frequencies are ordering water and ordering life. So please tell us some more about those
Absolutely.
oscillations.
Absolutely. So, so when I work with frequency, the biggest distinction I started making when I started observing these frequency combinations in oscilloscopes was the difference between chaotic forms and coherent or resonant forms of sound. And I noticed that certain combinations of frequency, when put together, would generate incoherent and wobbly, unstable forms. Whereas when I would put frequencies that were related through specific harmonic ratios found in nature, those geometries would come out to be very coherent because they are in resonance. So this research that I've been doing for years involves observing frequencies in an oscilloscope. Normally, I work with sine tones because the sine tone is the most pure form of sinusoidal waves. And when I work with the geometry art that I do, I combine different frequencies that are related through different principles. So for example, I started off observing the ratios in either the 440 equal temperament tuning system, which is the Western tuning standard that we are all familiar with. And I was comparing them with the geometries in the 432 just intonation and Pythagorean tuning systems. And I noticed that when I took the frequency combinations, so 2 or more frequencies from the 440 equal temperament system, any 2 frequencies that I would put into the oscilloscope would render a geometry that was unstable and incoherent. Whereas when I put these frequencies from the 432, just intonation, Pythagorean tuning systems into the oscilloscope, they were forming these coherent, beautiful geometries. And I started investigating, wondering why we're not using these globally if we have the power to access this level of coherence in our creations. Why isn't it so widely available? So I started making that part of my life mission to explore these different relationships, tonal relationships, ratios. And I started looking into all kinds of different systems. One of the systems I looked into was Malcolm Bendall's plasmoid unification model. And this is an incredible diagram that encodes various aspects of reality and puts them into a circular structure. And one of my favorite lines from the plasmoid unification model is the line that encodes the great year, which is 25,920. And the great year is a very interesting, it's a very interesting way that we can use to understand more deeply cycles of time and to bridge our awareness with music and tonality together with that understanding, because that particular cycle is based off of a very complex astral alignment that only happens every 25,920 years. And so when you start dividing from that number down, then you have these increments that can then be used as little divisors that you can use to track time. So I'm very interested in observing different cycles of time and how we can kind of sync our music up with these cycles. So yeah, so in the plasmoid unification model, he has a line that encodes that particular frequency. So I would take all of the different frequencies in that line or in all of the lines, convert them into sine tones in a signal generator called an oscillator in the computer. And I would combine them together and I would put that through an oscilloscope, which is the visualizer, and I would see what type of geometry it would yield. And so this has basically been my life's work, not only as an artist, but also as a scientist. And yeah, it keeps on going all the time. And just to relate it back to your question about water, is that these different frequencies, when you apply them to water, they do influence the level of coherence in the water. And Robert has done so many fascinating experiments that show this, that show different combinations of frequencies can yield water that is vitalized or devitalized. Yeah.
Such beautiful work. The imagery is amazing. If we have do we have the unification model here that we can show? I think it'd be really helpful to show the basis of what Sheila was referring to in terms of the providing the inputs. And the plasma unification model, plasmoid, is all about relationships. And what we continue to discover is the relational model of everything in the cosmos and everything that manifests. And in Robert's work, right, we're finding the relationships and those energies that are creating that geometry is part of what gives rise to some of the principles that you're discovering, correct? Would that be correct?
The oscillations and its frequency go one-on-one to, you'd call it, geometry, sacred geometry. That, the full nature of that connection has not been explored. It's going to happen, though. Maybe I'll say a word about the Pythagorean tuning. I don't know where to start. I'll start with Kepler. Kepler wrote a book called The Harmonies of the World. Kepler was an astronomer, one of the early astronomers, maybe the earliest one, that had the Earth revolving around the sun, against the model that the Earth was the center of the universe and the sun is revolving around the Earth. He analyzed everything from the point of view of the Pythagorean tuning. The length, the time it takes to go around the sun, the mass of the planet. And he related it in the Pythagorean tuning. You know what this is? That relationship is holding throughout our world. You know that the relationship between the planets with the Pythagorean tuning is exactly the same relationship between the hormones, the major hormones that come out of each gland. It's the same tuning. How does that happen? You're saying to me that a planet way out there has a relationship to something inside me? Come on. You think that's crazy? Where does that come from? Go back to unity. It comes from the basis of the unity of the Creator. And everything that gets created participates in that unity. And it participates in different ways. Give you another example. In a paper published in 2017 in the medical literature, reviewed papers that were published in the medical literature from about 1965 to around 2015. Each of these papers treated, in vitro or in vivo, treated some condition. For example, if it's in a petri dish and you have cancer cells and they're replicating. And if I apply a frequency and it slows the replication rate, that's life beneficial. If I apply a different frequency and it speeds up the replication rate, that becomes life detrimental. What did this paper do? Took the results from all of these papers, around 500 papers, and started to plot where these frequencies were that were life beneficial. Do you know what they found? They found that these frequencies were exactly aligned to the Pythagorean tuning frequency starting at 1 hertz for a C. What happened? Science becomes materialistic. There's no need for anything because everything you have, you're looking for evidence. You're looking to make the mathematics and the statistics. This relates to this, and this causes this because of the equations. And so you have a godless world in science. But that's not the science tradition. It didn't start that way. And this is something that is happening in our age, where people are beginning to recognize this. And now I'll flip from that topic and go to the thunderstorm generator with Malcolm Bendall. You take the thunderstorm generator, you attach it to an engine that's a combustion engine. And what comes out? What's the exhaust look like? When you combust a fuel, like a hydrocarbon, you have carbon and hydrogen. Typically the carbon one after the other in a sort of a linear string, and the hydrogen sitting on top and the bottom. A lot of hydrogen, actually. And you burn it. What's the result? The carbon goes to carbon dioxide. The hydrogen goes to hydrogen oxide, actually, water, H2O. And what happens with the generator? The thunderstorm generator? The output is reduced carbon dioxide to in the order of 1%. It's more like 10% in a regular engine. And because things are incompletely burned, there's carbon monoxide. Just take a combustion engine and put it outside your window and have your window open and go to sleep. You may not wake up the next morning. There's a huge number of deaths. It's measured in the order of tens of thousands a year from the poisoning of carbon monoxide. The carbon monoxide level from an actual engine is below 1% with the thunderstorm generator. And amazingly enough, the level of oxygen is typically between 17 and 21%. That's the level of oxygen in the atmosphere. Do you realize I could breathe the exhaust that comes out of the thunderstorm generator, and it's okay? The science question is, how is it possible that this happens? So now we turn to Malcolm. Malcolm has a system of numbers based on the Vedic system. And it has relationships. For example, the moon has a diameter in miles. The units you have to use the old units, not the new units. Mile is an old unit. It's 2,116 miles. The diameter of the sun is 864,000 miles. In the Vedic system, you ignore the zeros. 216, 864. 216 doubled is 432. 432 doubled is 864. What do we have here? When you double something or half something, what are you doing in music? You're on a note here. You double it, you're at the next octave higher. Does it make a difference that you're at the next octave higher or this octave in terms of the note? No. There's a unity throughout all of the octaves. And that unity is within the number system that Malcolm Bendel uses for not just the thunderstorm generator, but it's a number system that involves time and ether and energy. I missed one. Blank out. Sorry. But anyway, it's based on certain, it's probably matter that I missed. Based on certain basic categories and the relationships between these categories. And the arithmetic, multiply, divide. An element like oxygen has a number in his system. 888. How does that happen? Do you know the atomic number of oxygen is? There's a unity within Malcolm Bendel's system. You take this unity and you put it before anybody, just about anybody in the world of the scientists. They'll look at it. It has nothing to do with anything. It's all happenstance. It's nothing to do with anything. But that is the system which Malcolm used to design the thunderstorm generator. How's that possible? Was he just lucky? Because he used the same system to design turbine blades and their angles. And you know what? They're more efficient. But that's not to the end. Do you realize where this energy thing is going? Energy coming from the vacuum, as I pointed out, in the coherence domains of the water. It's going to be possible to develop a battery. Battery's going to use the plasmoids, which I really haven't talked about. The battery is going to be rated in terms of kilowatts. Kilowatt is energy per unit time. It's not rated in energy. The battery in your automobile is rated in energy. The battery holds this amount of energy. When that energy is taken out of the battery is useless and you have to recharge it. I can take a 7 kilowatt battery if I have a small house and hook it up into the electric system of the house. And that battery does not need recharging. Where is the energy coming from? Hey, 0 point. Remember the business with the oscillations in the coherence domain? We have something, battery. You can power your house for 2 to 3 decades with that battery. You never have to recharge it. Tell me what that is going to do in the civilization of our world. Tell me what it's going to do to the places which are the poorest places, where water is hard to get, expensive, where electricity is very little and not doing much because it's too expensive to put in the infrastructure to do it. And now you bring a battery and you bring it into a household and it lasts for decades. What is that going to do? The technology that Malcolm is bringing into existence based on system, which is not the current science system, based on a very old system. That system did exist earlier. So in the Western society, there was something that the Israelites had. It's called the Ark of the Covenant. The temple had a big, I want to say, like a big dish. It was meters across, and it had water in it. It was outside the temple. They're in the Mideastern environment, and the sun is shining on the water. Do you know what happens when you shine energy like sun into the water? You increase the coherence domains. That was where, in that big dish, in that big bowl, the coherence domains formed. Plasmoids formed. And there was a connection between that and what was going on in the Ark of the Covenant, which was just not a box. It had in it something that was special, that would generate its own energy and maintain some kind of connection. We don't understand this, but it made some kind of a connection to the Creator. This is old science. It was present and known to King Solomon in those years. Isn't that amazing? That's the same technology. You go into the ancient Vedas, and they talk about this technology too. But they don't use science terms. They use the language of that time. And they stretch the meaning of certain words and combinations so that it had a specific meaning. This is old technology placed in a modern setting. Now tell me that's not amazing. Just let me hear it's not amazing.
Creator's math is always amazing.
It's amazing.
Amazing, yes.
And that's what's going on here is creator's math. And certain beings are designated to wake up to it at certain times in order to help the trajectory of humanity. I want to thank you all for even being part of this amazing group.